speaker is Johanna Oksala, who is a fellow at the Academy of Finland, a research fellow there, and currently also teaching here a very popular course on Foucault. So I'm sure you have become already familiar with her. Among her publication, I will only mention her book on Foucault, Foucault on Freedom, published in 2005. She has also another book on Foucault called Foucault, Politics and Violence, published in 2012, and her current book project is a book on feminism, right?
That's right.
Our second speaker will be Cinzia Arruzza, who is an assistant professor here. Among her research interests, besides being our ancient philosophy person, she's also working on Marxism and feminism, and her major publication in this area is a book called Dangerous Liaison, Marriages and Divorces of Marxism and Feminism, which has been translated already in a number of foreign languages. And our last speaker, last but not least, is the case to say, is Nancy Fraser. We are all happy she's back after a long research leave. She doesn't need much of an introduction. I will just mention the major publication in the area of feminism for which she's known, in particularly Justice Interruptus, published in 1997, her exchange with Arcelon and Redistribution or Recognition, published in 2003, Scales of Justice, Reimagining Political Space in a Globalizing World, 2008, and her recently published Fortunes of Feminism, from state-managed capitalism to neoliberal crisis. Please join me in welcoming our speaker.
This is particularly for me, of course, a great opportunity and a pleasure. We are going to make short comments. I've organized my comments around two fairly general questions. So these questions, I don't intend to provide a comprehensive answer to them. They're more invitations for you to think about them and contribute to the answer, hopefully. But I will say something on two questions. The first question is simply this. Why is capitalism a feminist issue? So why should feminists be opposed to or critical of capitalism? So while there are obviously several good reasons to be critical of capitalism, it's not obvious how those reasons are specifically feminist issues. So think of economic inequity, exploitation, the destruction of the planet. These seem to be problems that affect equally men and women. And as women are situated in all social classes, they moreover seem to be affected in very different, even contradictory ways by capitalism. Now, Marxist feminist theory has usually made the connection between gender oppression and capitalism through women's effective or reproductive labor. Now, I'm going to really simplify the argument here for time's sake, but as far as I understand, the argument is roughly this. Capitalism necessarily needs women's effective labor because it needs a labor force. So the existing labor force has to be fed, clothed, nursed, and cared for, but also someone has to bear children, care for them, teach them various social and other skills, so that they can be usefully employed by the capitalists when they grow up and replace the labor force. Now, although the liberal capitalist framework effectively portrays reproduction as a free consumer choice, so that the decision to have a child is another costly preference, from a Marxist feminist perspective, children have to be recognized as a necessary condition for any form of continuing production. So capitalism and gender oppression would be necessarily intertwined because of the necessity to uphold a sexist division of labor and to rely on women's unpaid reproductive labor in the private sphere. Now, in the paper that I presented a couple of weeks ago, I discussed the attempts by some contemporary theorists who have argued that, in fact, the role of effective or reproductive labor in today's capitalism has significantly changed. So even if this necessary coupling of capitalism and gender oppression was historically true, now their intertwinement is rapidly unraveling in advanced capitalism. And the argument again is very simplified, that as effective labor is increasingly commodified, it becomes also increasingly degendered. So effective labor simply is not exclusively performed by women in the private sphere any longer. So we have witnessed a significant reconstitution of family, kinship, and intimate relationships in the recent decades. They too have been permeated by the logic of the market and have become less premised on permanent familial ties. So I think it's fair to say that neoliberal governmentality has brought about this increasing commodification and marketization of the private realm. It has also been argued that from a purely economic perspective, the gender of the care providers has become less significant. Wendy Brown, for example, has argued that advanced capitalism has the tendency to erode social differences in the long run, and that the logic of capitalism as such does not seem to require gender subordination. There's nothing in sexed bodies that capitalism cannot live without. She writes that, quote, in advanced capitalism, physical strength is rarely at issue, continuity of the job is irrelevant, and even reproductive work can be commodified to some extent, unquote. And I think this to some extent is important here. So I think we have to, in fact, identify two different and opposing tendencies in capitalism concerning reproductive labor. On the one hand, there is the constant drive to extend the reach of the markets, to commodify the private realm, and to turn women into wage laborers. This corresponds to the logic of capitalism clearly. But on the other hand, I think there is nevertheless this fundamental necessity to uphold a sexist division of labor and to rely on women's unpaid reproductive labor in the private sphere, as it has de facto proven indispensable for the reproduction of labor force and a functioning modern capitalist economy. So I argued that women must carry the burden of reproduction in a disproportionate manner due to their biological capacity to get pregnant and give birth. And second, because the reproductive labor that they currently perform cannot be completely commodified and brought into the realm of market transactions, at least not in the forms of life that we currently consider as appropriate for humans. So, at the risk of being accused of biological determinism, which of course is the worst thing that any feminist can be accused of, I want to nevertheless insist that when we assess capitalism from a feminist perspective, we have to emphasize the significance of women's role in reproduction, because this is essentially what, in my view, makes capitalism a feminist problem. Now, the second question I want to invite you to think about is the convergence of feminism and neoliberalism, or the way Nancy has provocatively put the question, how feminism became capitalism's handmaiden. So I think this is a important question to ask today. Now, I want to make a short Foucauldian intervention here. Now, Foucault's best known and in my view, most important contribution to feminist theory is his philosophical insight that any analysis of power relations must recognize how these relations are constitutive of the subjects involved in them. So power cannot be conceived of as an external relation that takes place between pre-constituted subjects, but has to be understood as constituting the subjects themselves. So, and I think this insight must continue to remain essential or central when we try to understand and evaluate the impact of neoliberalism on feminist theory and politics. Now, if we accept that neoliberal techniques of governing have come to increasingly characterize our society, and if we also accept the Foucauldian claim that there is an ineliminable tie between forms of power and forms of the subject, then it must follow that the neoliberal turn concerning techniques of governing has necessitated a change in the corresponding construction of the subject. So the spread and intensification of neoliberal governmentality, this is my claim, has meant that women too have come to be seen and to see themselves increasingly as neoliberal subjects, egoistical subjects of interest, making free choices based on rational economic calculation. And of course, if we accept this, then this will have profound consequences for the forms of feminist politics. Now, my argument here is philosophical or theoretical, but I think it can be so it can't be proven conclusively with any empirical evidence. But I think it can be illustrated or documented in different ways by analyzing visual culture or sociological data, for example. I will just give you a couple of examples. The sociologist Angela McRobbie, for example, has combined elements of feminist sociology with cultural studies in a provocative attempt to map out the field of what she calls post-feminist popular and political culture, mainly in a UK framework. So she surveys changes in film, television, popular culture, women's magazines, and demonstrates how sort of traditional feminist content has disappeared from them in the last decades and has been replaced by aggressive individualism, by hedonistic female phallicism in the field of sexuality, and obsession with consumer culture. Ariel Levy's Female Chauvinist Pigs, a very influential book, documents this same shift in cultural attitudes. Levy describes the way that the increasing pornification of all aspects of everyday life is no longer understood in opposition to feminist political aims, but instead is seen as evidence that feminism has already achieved its goals. So the fact that women too read Playboy and get Brazilian bikini waxes is increasingly understood as a sign of their liberation and empowerment. Now, so I'm suggesting that that a Foucauldian approach to neoliberalism, in a sense, makes visible that neoliberalism cannot be understood or limited simply as a political program intended to dismantle the welfare state, for example. As a form of governmentality, it's constitutive of our conceptions of politics and political action, but also of ourselves as political subjects. So women, feminism, feminist politics, these are not natural apolitical entities that are simply affected by certain empirical changes in society. They are fundamentally shaped and constituted by these changes, as well as our conceptions and background beliefs about the social world. So assessing the relationship between neoliberalism and feminism requires rethinking how our conceptions of female subjectivity, for example, political action or feminist liberation, have themselves changed due to the impact of neoliberal hegemony. So to conclude, I'm in full agreement with Marxist feminists that we must return to a critical analysis of capitalism. But I also want to insist that it's not that such a project should not be understood simply as an attempt to transform our political or economic institutions, but more fundamentally it must be an attempt to transform ourselves and our way of life. So we need what Foucault would call a politics of ourselves that acknowledges that it is through us, our subjectivity, that neoliberal governmentality is able to function. Okay, thanks.
I will begin with an apology because as usual, I fell into utopianism. So I wanted to do in 15 minutes what is impossible to do in 15 minutes. So addressing a very complicated issue, trying to say something that makes sense, and of course I failed. So what I'm going to read now is a text which is too concise, too condensed, probably ununderstandable, and certainly unpersuasive. But I'm going to read it anyway, also because I also fall into some form of masochism sometimes. So this is one of these occasions. Because what I wanted to address in these 15 minutes is the reason why I think that actually we should go back to Marxist critique of political economy. And that the second part of my claim is that Marxist analysis of capitalism actually enables us to retrieve a non-deterministic and non-reductionist notion of social whole. And in this way can offer actually a fruitful framework for the conceptualization of gender oppression under capitalism and of its intersection with other forms of domination, for example, in power, for example, race. So in order to support this view, I need first to briefly show how Marxist conceptualization of capitalism is not a strictly economic one. So it is a misunderstanding to think that Marxist critique of capitalism and of political economy is simply economic, or it is carried on simply through economic categories. So I will begin with a quotation from Daniel Ben Said's little book, Les Irréductibles. He writes, "In Marx, capital is the subject of a process which is not strictly economic. It articulates the processes of production, circulation, therefore of distribution, and of total reproduction. The critique of political economy is first of all a critique of economic fetishism and of its ideology, which condemns us to think in the shadow of capital." End of the quote. Now, what I think to be thinking in the shadow of capital is, in my view, to surrender to the fragmentation of our perceptual and cognitive experience induced by the very logic and inner working of capitalism itself. So in the few minutes at my disposal, I would like to dispel two common and what I think are actually two symmetrical misconceptions arising from an economist and reductionist interpretation of the nature of Marxist critique of capitalism. The first misconception consists of presupposing that the Marxian critique of political economy addresses the pure economic laws of capital through purely economic categories, which would then not be adequate to understand complex phenomena of life, such as the multiplicity of power relations and discursive practices that constitute us as subjects. This is why alternative epistemological approaches are considered to be more adequate to grasping the specificity and irreducibility of these sets of social relations. And this presupposition is common to a wide range of feminist theories, at least in what I've read. The reason why I'm addressing this point is that actually most of the literature, feminist literature I read that deals also with the issue of intersections and so on, what is usually claimed is precisely that actually Marxian categories are absolutely inadequate because they are strictly economic, and this is why we need something else. And I'm not denying that we need also something else. What I'm denying is that is the first part of the claim, which is that what we get from the Marxist critique of political economy is just a purely economic critique. So what happens usually then, at least in the literature I've read, is that either this presupposition leads to the fact of then thinking that we need to combine different strands of critique, the ones addressing the pure economic laws of capitalist accumulation and the others addressing other forms of social relations, which, while they can combine with the relations of exploitation in a contingent way, nonetheless follow their own capital-independent autonomous logic, while others within the feminist literature have just endorsed what I would call the linguistic turn in feminist critique, divorcing the critique of gender oppression from that of capitalism altogether. Now, in both cases, the shared presupposition is that pure economic laws exist independently of specific relations of domination and alienation. And it is precisely this kind of presupposition that I'm going to briefly challenge. I must say also that this presupposition is actually common to a certain number of Marxist thinkers. So it's not just non-Marxist or anti-Marxist thinkers that have read Marx in this way. Reductionist tendencies are present also, of course, in the Marxist tradition itself. So for reasons of time, I will make only 2 points. But I could make many more other points, and you should just believe me because I have no way to prove that this is the case. But I will make two main points here. One concerning what is exploitation, and the other how Marx addresses exploitation, and the other concerning the unity of production and reproduction. Now, for Marx, a relation of exploitation always entails one of domination and alienation. These 3 aspects are never really separated in Marxist critique of political economy. The laborer is first of all a living and thinking body subject to specific forms of discipline that reshape both the laborer and her body. As Marx writes both in Capital and in the Grundrisse, the production process, or in any case every kind of work process, produces the worker herself. So the worker, by working, is reproducing and producing the capitalist relation, capitalism itself, but is also reproducing herself as a worker, and not just as a generic human being, but as a member of a specific class, characterized by dispossession and exploitation, and as a human being with some specific historically determined and socially produced features. As each production process or work process is always a concrete one, that is, it is one endowed with concrete, geographically and historically specific features, we may understand each production process as a contextually specific disciplinary process, partially constituting the kind of subject the worker is. The same holds for commodity consumption, by the way, and that in Marx actually contributes to the formation of specific subjects. And there are some recent works, for example, by Kevin Floyd, showing how, for example, commodity consumption not only has a disciplinary character, so it shouldn't be understood as free consumerist choices, but actually as disciplinary patterns of consumption, but also play a crucial role in the process of reification of sexual identities. So, again, just to sum up, my idea of what Marx is doing when he analyzes, for example, how the production process works, is that for him, the production process is at the same time a process of exploitation, but also of discipline, a disciplinary process actually giving shape, constituting the kind of subject the worker is. And this happens also on the market through commodity consumption. The second point I want to make has to do with the unity of production and reproduction. I'm speaking about unity because actually Marx very explicitly, especially in the introduction to the Grundrisse, says that production and reproduction constitute an indivisible unity. That is to say that while they are distinct and they have their own features, they are necessarily combined together as concrete moments of an articulated whole. So to use Althusser's words, every child knows that a social formation which did not reproduce the conditions of production at the same time as it produced would not last a year. Which means that education, the cultural industry, police, churches, the army, the healthcare system, sciences, gender discourses, racialized discourses, and patterns of consumption all play a crucial role in reproducing specific relations of production. This process, however, should not be understood in deterministic and mechanical terms. And indeed, Marx does not conceive it in this way. as all of these different aspects of this concrete social formation, which is capitalism, can be and very often are out of joint, fundamentally out of joint. For example, when Marx writes about arts, there is a little passage in the Grundrisse. He says, in the case of the arts, it is well known that certain periods of their flowering are out of all proportion to the general development of society, hence also to the material foundation, the skeletal structure, as it were, of its organization. So in other words, how I interpret this issue in Marx is that production and reproduction form a social totality, and I do think that Marx understands capitalism in terms of social totality. However, it does not understand capitalism as an expressive totality. In other words, as a totality in which each part automatically reflects the other and expresses the others and the whole. So all these elements are combined together, but in contradictory ways. They are fundamentally out of joint. Now, to go back to the issue of the unity of production and reproduction, to analyze capitalism without taking into account this unity means, in my view, to fall into vulgar materialism and economism, what Marx would call vulgar materialism. And indeed, Marx himself does not make this mistake, in my view. And this appears clear, for example, from the passages on the struggles on the working day, or on primitive accumulation in Capital Volume 1, where coercion, so the use of force, direct force, the active intervention of the state, and class struggle appear as constitutive component of the relation of exploitation. Another way to articulate this point is Balibar's definition of Marxist materialism, when he writes in The Philosophy of Marx that Marxist materialism should not be understood as a mere inversion of the hierarchy, a theoretical workerism, as has been the charge of Hannah Arendt and others, that is a primacy accorded to poiesis over praxis by virtue of its direct relationship with matter. But what the Marxist materialism is the identification of the two, the revolutionary thesis that praxis constantly passes over poiesis and vice versa. So, as you may have noticed, I am not referring to Marxist political writings because this would be really too easy, because it is absolutely clear when one reads Marxist political writings, it is absolutely clear how he doesn't have a reductionist or deterministic approach to political phenomena. But what I wanted to show was something, and of course I failed, it was something more complicated, which is that in Marx's very critique of political economy, so in the economic writings, actually capital is never addressed in purely economic terms. This, again, doesn't mean that in the Marxist tradition there are no reductionist tendencies. Of course there are, but my contention is that they arise from a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of Marxist critique of political economy. The second misconception, the one that was symmetrical to the one I just explained, consists of understanding the unity between production and reproduction in terms of pure and unmediated identity. And this has been a trend, for example, in part of Marxist feminist thought, that has insisted that reproductive work is directly productive work and governed by the same laws. So I'm not going to spend many words on this point because actually Johanna has given an entire very persuasive talk on this problem of the distinction between production and reproduction and the critique of Marxist feminist thought influenced by Italian operaismo. So I will confine myself to saying that I consider this identification as a form of reductionism, which blurs the differences and does not help us understand the specific features of the diverse relations of domination constantly reproduced but also transformed in each capitalist social formation. Moreover, it does not help us analyze the way in which sets of power relations at the same time do take place and are reproduced outside the formal labor market, while being inherently mediated through the market, for example, through disciplinary forms of commodity consumption, or also, more simply, through the objective constraints on personal life and interpersonal relations that are imposed by wage labor. So I will conclude very briefly with a positive proposal. The combination of economic crisis and of the crisis of feminism, critical and emancipatory potential that has been recently addressed by Nancy in the article, for example, quoted earlier by Johanna. The combination of these two crises should lead us, if we have an interest in changing the current state of affairs, to question the nature and theoretical presuppositions of our critique of gender and sexual oppression. Now, I think that not all strands in feminist theory of the last decades have made abstraction from capitalism and class relations. For example, in recent years, intersectionality feminism has developed crucial work concerning the ways in which subjectivity and identity are constituted by mutually reinforcing and reshaping vectors of race, gender, class, and sexuality. And moreover, especially in more recent years, intersectional feminists have tried to grasp and conceptualize the dynamic and not static and mechanical character of such intersections. However, I would agree with the intersectional feminist Jennifer Nash, who wrote an article in 2008 emphasizing the fact that intersectionality theory has been struggling with its own theoretical and methodological murkiness, and with the ambiguity of its own definition. So my working hypothesis, the final proposal, is meant to be not as a critique of intersectional feminism, but actually as an integration. So what I want to do is to offer a contribution to intersectionality theory. And my idea is that in order to adequately conceptualize intersections, we need to clarify, we need to theoretically clarify the framework in which intersections do take place. And my idea, as you may have guessed, is that the Marxist critique of political economy actually does offer us a good framework, a good one. So to conclude, I will then borrow the perspective of two social reproduction feminist thinkers, Bakker and Gill, who have insisted on the fact that in order to understand how a social formation reproduces itself, we need to analyze the social relations of production and the mediation and transformation of these relations through purposive activity together, so not separately but together, with the role of human subjectivity, which also includes the way this subjectivity is constituted through class, gender, racialization, sexuality, and so on. These, however, are not different levels or structures, like as if they were spatially separated and relating to each other in an external way, but rather, this is their proposal, they should be understood as different moments internally combined with each other of a contradictory unity, so as moments of a unity. And this unity, this contradictory unity, is the unity of the capitalist society. Thank you.
I'll see why I came back to the news. Where else could we have this kind of discussion? It's really fantastic. I want to try to address, in my way, the two questions that Johanna posed at the outset. Why is capitalism a feminist issue? And if I could give the second one a gloss with apologies to Thomas Frank. What's the matter with feminism? As in, what's the matter with Kansas? Why is capitalism a feminist issue? What I want to say about this takes off from Cinzia's attempt to define capitalism as something other than and indeed bigger than an economic system. I agree with that. And my proposal would be that we should think of capitalism as an institutional order on a par with feudalism. So it's not just an economy. Rather, it's a way of structuring through a series of institutional separations a whole set of social practices and social functions. As I understand it, the institutional order of capitalism, and I'll speak first about its initial emergence. I'm going to try to do this historically. Its initial emergence from within a pre-capitalist, decaying feudal world is premised on three major institutional separations and divisions. And you're going to see why I think gender is going to be central. The first is a division that both previous speakers have mentioned between production and reproduction. And what I want to stress here is that this is a capitalist division. This is a division that is created by and within capitalism. We, looking back at pre-capitalist societies, can say, oh yeah, here this is production and this is reproduction. But nobody ever living then would have thought of it that way, or would have actually been able to identify dedicated spaces or institutions where these things went on in a way that was separated from one another. Capitalism does that. And it does it by precipitating out a certain set of socially necessary activities and organizing them through the exploitation of the labor power of propertyless workers. So whether we're talking about manufacturing or about agriculture or whatever, suddenly a class of socially necessary activities that used to be quite integrated with all sorts of other things has been separated, has been moved to a whole new location, a factory or an office, and has been organized according to a whole new disciplinary logic and a whole new, yes, economic logic, in the sense that it is monetized and organized through labor markets. Everything else is left behind. And in my view, reproduction is a very broad category for what is left behind. So it's a little bit broader for me. Well, maybe not. It's broader than the way Johanna started out in an orthodox Marxist feminist way. It wasn't your own view, I realize, to think of it in terms of reproduction of labor power in the narrow sense. I would prefer, rather, and I think this would encompass the Foucauldian problematic, the subjectivation and neoliberal governmentality problematic, although that's already jumping ahead several hundred years and I'm not there yet. But for me, it encompasses all of the activities that are involve the creation, the maintenance, and the remaking of social bonds. That certainly includes the production and maintenance and care of the next generation, and its education, socialization, but it also includes all those activities that maintain social bonds among communities that are wider than just people living in a household together. Whether you're talking about neighborhoods, village life, et cetera, et cetera. So all of this is the left behind, to use the Christian idea. This is all sort of left behind. It's organized in a different way. It's not monetized. Now, because this is a capitalist creation, this division, these two terms, production and reproduction, are mutually defined in terms of one another. They develop in symbiosis with one another. Each is marked by this symbiosis. And they start to take on a whole set of binary connotations and colorations. Production is competitive, egoistic, interest-based. Reproduction is solidaristic, sentimental, et cetera, et cetera. And so by the time you get to the Victorian world, you know, you have a whole gendered ideology of separate spheres that reflects this division. Obviously, this division is deeply gendered. Capitalism relies on pre-existing gendered divisions and works them up in a sharp new form that imbricates them with a new form of male domination, not the first form by any means, but a new form that is grounded in exactly this division. the idea then is that insofar as the female-associated left behind reproduction supplies a set of absolutely necessary presuppositions and preconditions for the male-inflected, even though of course it includes women, and even though men do perform many actions outside of wage labor that contribute to social reproduction in the expanded sense. I mean, you have to grasp both the reality of the gender division and its obfuscatory ideological character. Both are true. Let's see, that sentence is getting too long, so I've lost what the beginning was. But in any case, the point is that the exploitation of labor in the new world of production rests upon and is inconceivable in the absence of all of the activities and inputs and presuppositions that emerge in that left behind realm of reproduction. And because it's a gendered division, gender inequality, gender hierarchy is very deeply and systemically grounded in capitalism as an institutionalized social order on a par with feudalism, every bit as deeply and systemically grounded as the exploitation of labor. It is if you like, a system characteristic of capitalism. Now, I said 3 divisions because I don't want to stop there. Every form of capitalism has a gender order that it involves this relation of production and reproduction, which, as I'll suggest in a minute, undergoes quite a striking set of shifts over the course of the history of capitalism. It doesn't just happen once and it is arrested there. But I want to mention the 2 other divisions. I won't speak about them at this in much detail because our subject is gender, but I think they're equally important. Capitalism also creates a separation, and Marx is very clear about this, between economy and polity. And that is truly definitive of capitalism as opposed to feudalism, for example, in which the control over labor and the control over military force and political power were all fused in the single institution of lordship and vassalage. In capitalism, economic power and political power are split apart. Each is given a kind of separate sphere and a separate MO, and it can appear as if what goes on in production is not political because it's operating according to this different market logic. That's an equally fundamental division, just like production. Reproduction, it too is an artifact, a creation of capitalism. And then I want, and polity, that is the operation of public powers, normally states, but we could also talk about the transnational and geopolitical level and the operation of global hegemons and so on and so forth. Public power is also a necessary presupposition for a capitalist economy. You're not going to get production, you're not going to get labor exploitation, and you're not going to get capital accumulation unless you have a legal order that guarantees and enforces property rights, unless you have an army that can put down rebellions, and a whole set and a system that can maintain a money supply, and so on and so forth. So that's also essential. And the third division that I would include in this picture, and you tell me when the time is going, is a very sharp, newly sharpened separation between the apparently non-natural human world and nature, now seen as something objective, material, inert, ahistorical, simply given, as opposed to the human, which is spiritual, cultural, historical, et cetera, et cetera. And so every phase of capitalism is premised on some version or another of this separation, and that is another constitutive aspect. Okay, now what I want to suggest as an alternative to the standard kind of system logic view of capitalism, which tells us what its imperatives require and what must happen, production, reproduction, division, different ways of organizing the polity economy division, different ways of organizing the human nature division. And on that basis, I'm being told I don't have that much time, but you can imagine that we could easily distinguish at least three main phases in the history of capitalism, namely competitive laissez-faire capitalism, state-organized monopoly capitalism, and the current globalizing neoliberal capitalism. Each one of them has a different way of organizing production, reproduction. The division is always there, but where the line is drawn and how differs. Each has a different way of distinguishing polity and economy and human nature. Each has a different energy basis. So for me, the question of gender and the gender order as an absolutely central and definitive constituent of any regime of capital accumulation needs to be understood in this kind of structural way. And on that basis, I would suggest that, as Johanna suggested, the transition from the state-organized monopoly capitalism, which was the era in which the second wave of feminism emerged, has undergone a very dramatic change as it is morphed into the neoliberal globalizing capitalism, and the changes in the gender order are central to this. Neoliberal capitalism is very heavily dependent on women's wage labor. We see a massive influx of women throughout the world. Yet, there is very little change in the gender division of reproductive labor. This remains overwhelmingly, at least the domestic aspects of it, women's work. At the same time, there is a tremendous pressure from financial institutions and governing bodies to redraw the economy polity division, to retrench state provision of elements of social reproduction, which had become, let's say, deprivatized, but not commodified, treated as public services and public goods in the state-organized form of capitalism. There's tremendous pressure now to commodify those, or we're not commodified, to re-privatize them, to put them back into the household. And so we are seeing, I think, the social reproduction aspect of capitalism under a tremendous squeeze. Women are supposed to deploy hours and hours elsewhere, often a double, or triple, quadruple shift of work, and at the same time, states are retrenching provision. So I think that social reproduction now is becoming a major flashpoint and node of crisis, every bit as important as the financial aspect of crisis or the ecological or political aspect of crisis. And I could say something, but I don't have time, about each of those other ones in terms of the same model of these divisions and how the divisions are changing. Okay, what's the matter with capitalism? No, sorry, there's lots the matter with feminism. Feminism is not independent of its context. It always will take on the coloration of the zeitgeist in which it develops, and this is true from its from Mary Wollstonecraft to the present. The feminism that I grew up with in the second wave was deeply colored by the new left, anti-imperialist, participatory democratic, and anti-capitalist culture in which it emerged, and many of its, virtually all of its most important critical ideas, critical of gender relations, were situated against the background of a whole set of related critical attitudes. Unfortunately, many of those, that context has changed dramatically. Many of those critical attitudes, anti-capitalist attitudes, anti-imperialist attitudes, have fallen away. And we now have a zeitgeist in which commodification, meritocratic advancement, women who can lean in with respect to corporate power, or carry a certain charisma, and this shapes our idea of what emancipation is. This is a huge mistake. There is nothing emancipatory about all of this. But feminist ideas have been subtly, or perhaps not so subtly, transmuted through this kind of market imaginary that colonizes all our ideas about emancipation today. Hence we have that dangerous liaison that the other speakers mentioned. Feminism is not automatically on the left. If feminism is going to be on the left, it's because we are going to make it so. Feminism is not necessarily left. It really isn't. It has actually historically quite a deep natural affinity with liberalism, insofar as both share an antipathy and a desire to overcome traditional hierarchical forms of authority. Those are forms that characterized earlier forms of male domination, the dyadic forms of mastery and subjection in a household, for example. And those kinds of relations have, for the most part, in the modern era, it formed fetters and barriers to marketization and capitalist development. So it's understandable that there has been a kind of convergence historically between feminism, or what we might call liberal feminism, and why that would be dominant, and capitalism. It's only in extraordinary times that the power of that natural affinity can be broken, as it was in the early days of second wave feminism, because of that larger zeitgeist. And my wager is that we might be entering this kind of a time now, given the palpable horribleness of the present world, and the obviousness of the role of capitalism in creating that horribleness. I think that's, no one can doubt that. So maybe this is a moment where we could re-articulate feminism away from its market-friendly neoliberal form and win it for the left.